Well, welcome back to the Solutions Manual podcast. We are so excited to introduce Dr. Julie Miwa. She is a neuroscientist and founder of the NeuroSalon Project. And the NeuroSalon Project talks about the brain in accessible ways to empower people with knowledge for their brain health and mental well-being. And it uses storytelling, art, music, and dance to communicate and to invite people to add more creative activities into their lives. And I know we will be talking a lot more about the NeuroSalon. Julie is an associate professor at Lehigh University in biological sciences, where she researches genetics of learning and neuroplasticity. So welcome, Julie, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
And solutions makers, Maciek and I work with people for personal and professional longevity. So one of the core foundations of our approach is cognitive health and behavior, and not just to prevent disease or decline, but as a fundamental pillar of health and longevity. So we'll probably be asking you a lot of questions about cognition and neuroplasticity and your own experience too. So that's why we have you today. So thank you so much.
Excited to be speaking to you.
So since this is actually a brief introduction to cognitive performance that we've done a couple of months ago, we really haven't dived into neuroscience and neuroplasticity. So before we do that, maybe we should just ask you to define, what are we even talking about when we talk about neuroplasticity and maybe some of the basic mechanisms around that, just to help people understand when we get a little bit more into the science later.
Right. So the brain is a very fascinating, complex organ, and we have this ability to adapt. The cells in our brains, which the major ones that are in our brains are neurons, and they connect through synapses. Neuroplasticity is the ability for those synapses to strengthen or weaken or just mold itself based on our experiences. So this sort of gives us this ability to learn from our experiences and then make better solutions into the future.
And I just want to ask you a very quick question. And some people say that essentially everything that we do has an impact or makes some change in a brain. So how do the approaches, the neuroplastic approaches, those that actually shape or help our brain grow and perform better, how do they differ from just doing anything?
Well, it's really important since there's so much information that comes to us and we can encode so many memories that there's a way in which we can highlight or emphasize those memories or experiences that are important to us. So we call that salience. Mechanistically, there's one neurotransmitter system in the brain, the acetylcholine receptor system, and more of this neurochemical acetylcholine will be released under salient events. So that kind of gives a little bit of a boost because it's an excitatory molecule. And so it just helps to communicate this information that, hey, let's try to encode this into a memory because it's important to us.
Acetylcholine, it's something that's produced at the end of a neuron, right? Of the cell that transmits the electrical signals, right? So it doesn't only happen in the brain, and also has an impact on, for example, making the muscles move, right? So it's like a molecule that allows nerve cells to talk to each other.
Right. Exactly. So the important thing is that there are different flavors of neurochemicals. So the major ones are glutamate and GABA, but there are these other modulatory neurotransmitters like acetylcholine, but you've also probably heard of dopamine. So these help to emphasize or amplify or inhibit the normal communication that's going on between the major neurotransmitters, glutamate and GABA. And the important thing to understand is that our neurons are really factories for these different neurochemicals, but they won't really be released and have any function unless the neuron will fire or be active. So that's the way in which we can kind of influence the different types and amount of neurotransmitters that are released from these neurons through our thoughts or activities. So things that we have control over.
So that's sort of part of creating this core or bank of memories. So when we actually learn something, how do we separate learning and memory, and how are those tied, and how do the mechanisms kind of reinforce what we can learn and then what we can actually store short term and long term?
Yeah, so we tend to lump learning and memory together as neuroscientists, but there are distinct aspects of it. So there is short-term memory and longer-term memory, and also spatially, there are different parts of the brain that will mediate the shorter-term memory, like the hippocampus, or the longer-term memory, like the cortex. So in order to, as you can kind of think of it as RAM, but for the shorter term memories, the things that were being coded into long term memories need to shuffle away from the hippocampus into the cortex in order to make room for new experiences.
So for an average person, why should we care? Why should an average person care about their neuroplasticity? Like, what does it mean? What does it mean for you, and why is it important to people?
Well, I think the major reason why I think this is important for everyone to understand has to do with whether we want people to be surviving or thriving. So if you can incorporate the right types of activities that will stimulate neuroplasticity, then it enables you to do a lot of different things, not only learn new skills, but also to gain in novel thought that might help you in problem solving. So to address certain problems that an individual would have in their lives, then this ability to have novel thought and creativity will help them make better decisions. So it's something that would, I think, enhance people's lives if they understood a little bit about how neuroplasticity works.
And how does that change as we get older?
Well, we have the most of it when we're young.
Yeah.
So when we're first born, we have so much robust plasticity, and that's wonderful. So we can learn so many new things. And then as we get older and more mature, then that slows down. So we can still learn as adults, but we might, let's say if we're trying to learn a new language, we might retain an accent.
Mm-hmm.
So we can still learn, but it's not as fluid. So the gene that I study is called LINX1, and we have very little of it when we're born, but then as we get older, then the gene turns on, and it really slows down this plasticity.
Mm-hmm.
So through genetic manipulations in animal models, if you remove that LINX gene, then you can have these animals that, as adults, have the useful plasticity.
Yes, and there is this saying that you can't teach an old dog new tricks to an old dog. And this has been, I believe, empirically observed by people who own pets. But we also know that quite a lot of recent research shows that, well, this is not entirely the case. We used to believe that after the age of 25, 26, humans essentially peak at their learning ability, and from that moment, everything keeps declining. But now we have increased body of evidence that with certain practices and certain approaches, we can maintain quite a lot of that ability to learn throughout life. And there are actually people who do it successfully. And we know that there are benefits to staying lifelong learners as well. Before we delve into this topic, just a quick question: How did you become interested in neuroplasticity? What's the story behind the personal interest?
Yeah, I think the reason I got interested in neuroscience was just the idea that because we're shaped by our experiences, our wiring from individual to individual will be unique. But the aspect that really fascinated me was the way in which the way we experience the world will be completely determined by that wiring, and therefore we're experiencing the world in so many different ways, and yet we still have to kind of come to a common understanding about the way the world is. So that always fascinated me, and I wanted to understand more about it. And I discovered the LINX gene, and that further instantiated my initial interest in neuroplasticity.
So coming back to the LINX gene, can you tell us a little bit more about that? And then are there things that we can do, or even in animal models, like how do we turn it down or off as we age? Is that possible? And then what capacity of learning is realistic to retain as we get older?
So that's an area of interest in my research. When the LINX gene turns on, it's made into a protein. This LINX protein, it binds to certain receptors in our brains. So a receptor is a special type of protein that is specifically designed to bind to a neurochemical, such as acetylcholine or dopamine or glutamate. So each different neurotransmitter has its own set of receptors that it will bind to. The LINX protein will also bind to the same receptor that acetylcholine binds to. We'll call them nicotine receptors.
Mm-hmm.
And when the LINX protein binds to this receptor, it sort of dials down the activity of the receptor.
Mm-hmm.
You can kind of think of it as like a parking brake on a car. It lowers the activity of the acetylcholine, the nicotine receptor. And because those receptors, as I said, are important for neuroplasticity, then the presence of LINX will be inhibitor or brake to neuroplasticity. But since the acetylcholine levels, so there's a balance between the levels of the LINX protein and the balance of the acetylcholine neurotransmitter. So if you swamp out your brain with high levels of acetylcholine, you can override this inhibitory effect of LINX.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe just the terminology as well for our listeners. You've mentioned the nicotine receptors in a brain, and I believe there will be not people's natural. They will recognize the word nicotine for the substance that people inhale in tobacco smoke, for example. So nicotine receptors these are the proteins in the brain, right? I assume we refer specifically to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the brain. So a class of proteins that respond to the neurotransmitters that we talked about. They can pick them up, and allow a flow of other chemicals through the membrane into and out of the neuron, pretty much everywhere in the brain. Right, they are in the cortex or the new parts of the brain, but also in the hippocampus, in the thalamus, and in the tegmental area of the brain. And their response. What's the specific role of those receptors? I know that definitely one is the dopamine release, because that's the mechanism in which people get addicted to nicotine, to smoking. There's more to them, right? I think they have a significant role in cognitive function in general, in regulating people's mood and how they feel as well.
Right. So it's true that these nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are expressed widely throughout the brain, and yet the neurons that release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine are pretty localized to a couple clusters deep in the brain, and then they send out their axons all over and release acetylcholine widely. So you can imagine, let's say, if you want to waken up your whole brain, when you wake up or something, you want your brain to be a little bit more sensitive to stimuli, then it might make sense to, hey, let's have a molecule that can just, we can blast the entire brain. So that's what the acetylcholine or cholinergic neurons will do, is they will fire these action potentials and release acetylcholine. Mm-hmm. And because all these different cells throughout the brain have that specialized receptor, the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, then when acetylcholine binds to them, they will send a ionic flow through the channel of that receptor. But essentially what will happen is it will help to excite the neuron that is expressing that receptor. So you can get more excitation into the neurons, and that kind of enables them to be a little bit more receptive to other incoming stimuli, to say, we're ready in case something important happens, to encode that into a memory.
Since those receptors are responsible for things like attention or consolidating memory or learning, and we know there are people who self-administer nicotine, right, because they believe it boosts their attention. However, we don't seem to be observing the beneficial impact for attention, memory consolidation, and learning in people who smoke, for example, right? So why is that the case? Why does the shortcut activation of those receptors with externally administered substances doesn't give people the benefits that we could expect
So for people who are already addicted to a substance, when they go off of that substance, they can have cravings or some, side effects because they're used to having that drug in their system. And that could really impair their attention, their level of anxiety, and therefore their cognitive performance. So when they intake that drug again, let's say they smoke a cigarette because they're addicted to nicotine, then they feel calmer because they're getting the drug of choice. And it gives them the impression that it's improving their attention, which indirectly it does just because it quells their cravings or some of the negative effects of the withdrawal. You can think of addiction as a set of many processes, and they're sequential. So you have, at just a protein level, you might have receptors binding nicotine, then they'll desensitize or downregulate. The brain will adjust. Oh, we have a lot of either the neurotransmitter acetylcholine or nicotine. We don't need as many receptors. So that is one effect. But then there's a lot of long-term effects that influence things like the connectivity between neurons that are very difficult. Then once you change the levels of nicotine, let's say you stop taking nicotine, you've made a long-term or even a permanent change in connectivity that's very difficult to step back from.
Okay, so that's interesting to understand that it's the negative impacts of nicotine on your cognitive performance is not just related to, let's say, its cardiovascular effects, right? Like for example, the slowing down or narrowing blood vessels, which limits the blood flow to and oxygen delivery to the brain, but it also has a direct impact on the neurons, right? So it's okay.
Yes. So sometimes when I've talked about neuroplasticity and nicotine receptors, people get really excited because they say, "Oh, nicotine receptors! Can I just ingest nicotine and get all this boost that you're talking about?" And the answer is no, you can't do that.
Absolutely.
You shouldn't ingest nicotine for any purpose. If you're addicted, you can't help it, but it's not going to give you the boost that you want. And there are all these sort of mechanistic reasons for it. But just one thing that I should say is, because you mentioned that the nicotine receptors are localized in the terminals or the ends of the neurons. So that's not as normal as being expressed in the dendrites or the part of the neuron that receives synapses. But having the nicotine receptors at the ends of neurons, like dopamine neurons, means that if a dopamine neuron fires once, if nicotine is there, then it's going to end up allowing more dopamine to be released. Because when the acetylcholine receptor is active, it's going to also add more excitation to the end of that dopamine neuron, and so give, let's say, twice as much dopamine and more bang for your buck. So, as you mentioned, that's the reason why nicotine is so addictive, because it influences dopamine. And the dopamine system, it's really good at compensating for its activity. So once you're used to a certain level of stimulation, then it's very difficult to get the rewarding effects that you would want. So it's not a good idea to start on nicotine, because its mechanism of action is different from acetylcholine, and so it'll have very much long-term benefits that you wouldn't get just by releasing acetylcholine, which would be much more beneficial. You can get that reward of dopamine release, but not the long-term negative effects that you get with nicotine.
So when we learn something new when we're young, don't we then experience some of this sort of reward and dopamine, partially because it's easier, maybe, as we get older and we do things intentionally for our brains and our brain health, and trying to be more conscientious of neuroplastic things like learning language, you said, or being creative or trying something new, or even practicing a musical instrument that maybe you haven't picked up in a while. Then is that then reinforced in a different way, other than, I mean, dopamine is one mechanism of the reward, but how does that change as we age, and especially today, where we're constantly on a dopamine kick and we're trying to get more. So how do we actually, what do we recommend, or what are ways to explain to people that it's worth trying to learn something new, try something creative, do something, even if it's just once, to push through that uncomfortable because of what is happening, and there will be a reward in the end. It just will feel different. So
right. So what you said at the beginning is that when we learn, we can get a bit of a reward from learning a new thing, and it can propel us to want to learn more new things. So the more you get into the habit of learning, then it can be this positive feedback loop. And the reason why I say that is we've been talking a lot about acetylcholine, but the reason the ways in which acetylcholine would be released in the brain, among which are sustained attention. So if you're paying long attention to something that you really care about, then you'll have more acetylcholine released into your brain, which is a positive thing not only for neuroplasticity, but for dopamine release. Dopamine, we talk about it in the context of addiction, but we evolved our dopamine system to help motivate us to work hard for our rewards, and also to instruct us as to what we should learn. So it's guiding us to say these are relevant behaviors. Now, the issue with modern society and technology is we can short circuit our dopamine system and get it without having to do the work. And that's teaching us the wrong thing. So we get addicted to going on the internet. But I think long-term true satisfaction in life comes from aligning your activities that would give you dopamine to your core values and your longer-term objectives. So the way to kind of get over that activational barrier is to break everything down into mini goals. So your dopamine system is driving you and they're active as you're working towards a goal. However, if you fail to achieve your goal, your dopamine neurons will be silent, and they're normally sort of at a low hum. So when they go silent, I kind of liken that to that feeling of crushing disappointment you get when you don't get your way. But as you're working towards your goal, your dopamine neurons are firing. If you set a goal that's too high, then you'll always get that sense of disappointment. But if you're setting mini goals that are activating these dopamine neurons, then it's as if you're intrinsically rewarded. You're not saying like, my boss is making me do this because, and I need this because I need a paycheck. But you're saying, I want to know this. I want to do this because it gives me satisfaction. So, as you're going along, you're intrinsically motivated because you're getting, dopamine release. And as you attend to your task, you're concentrating on it, you get more acetylcholine, which gives you more dopamine. So it's this positive cycle that kind of once you get on it, then you realize that it's much more satisfying than a short-term dopamine kick that you might get from the internet or a drug or something like that.
This is what we teach people in our cognitive performance courses, because the brain cannot distinguish whether the goal that you have achieved is a major one or a tiny one. It's the completion of the objective that helps with the release of the dopamine. And instead of trying to set yourself something ambitious that will take you months to achieve, if you break it down to tiny goals, tiny little steps, 10 of them every day that you can easily achieve in a way that almost makes failing them impossible, you start on this path of continuing success, what drives you and propels you forward. And we teach people exactly how to do this. I think that's a fantastic thing to learn, because it allows you can break any complex task or project into smaller steps, and an infinite amount of smaller steps. And that's a fantastic, I think, takeaway for people as well. We started using this term neuroplasticity, but what is it? How would we define it?
Right. So functionally, it would be changes in your synaptic strength, the synapses between the neurons based on experience. Heightened charge experiences will activate your neurons and your synapses more. And so you want to strengthen that connection so that you remember I shouldn't go down to that watering hole because when I went down there, I ran into a bear. Okay, I need to remember that. What will happen is those synapses will strengthen. And it does that in various ways, but I guess the first way would be that it puts more of these specialized proteins called receptors into the synapse so that when neuron A fires and releases the neurotransmitter, then receiving cell is going to have a bigger response because it has more of these receptors catching the neurotransmitter.
Okay, so if I have seen a bear last time in a zoo, and it was fed, well kept, happy, and very unlikely to cause me any danger in a modern world. And most of us today live in an environment that is very different to when our ancestors did and when our brains evolved. So, what is the benefit of me of having more neuroplastic brain, let's say, than my neighbor? Why would I invest my time or money or effort into trying to make my brain more neuroplastic? Why should I care?
Okay, there's a couple of reasons. One is that modern society, the rate of change is much faster than it was before. So to really adapt to this changing society, it kind of helps us to learn new things. But as you mentioned, it's like harder to learn as for when you're older, it's harder to learn things.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can have more neuroplasticity, then it enables you to sort of adapt to the changing environment. But there's another reason, and that is that when we're young, we're learning, and we usually learn things by coincidence detection. So two things happen at the same time. And our brains can't really tell if that's just a coincidence or causal. So it assumes it's sort of a causal thing. So an example I use is often, let's say, children of divorced parents will grow up thinking that they were responsible for their parents' divorce. And that's because when you're that young, you don't really have a good sense of self versus other. So everything is sort of interpreted as in a me-based way. So as an adult, you might realize that no, I'm not a bad person. I was not responsible for my parents' divorce. That was them. You intellectually you understand that, and yet your behavioral programs might be very difficult to change, and that's because your neuroplasticity has shut down. So as an adult, when you are more intellectually competent to understand nuances and complexities of the world, you have more difficulty in actually read those stories or to, change your connections that would allow you to change behavior.
I assume, especially if you haven't practiced, right? Because it's a skill that can be learned, right?
And we talk about updating your software. So if you have more neuroplasticity, then it will just make the updates to your software easier and faster for you to adapt to your society or your own changing environment and create what you need to be able to move yourself forward.
Right. So as a neuroscientist, when I'm trying to communicate this information, it's not something that is replacing psychology. It's basically nurturing your brain. So any of the changes that you might want to make are easier to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like cultivating the soil. You amend the soil so that when you plant seeds, they'll be better able to grow. And that's what this understanding is. It's not saying you need to learn a new language. It's saying we're going to try to cultivate your brain so that anything new that you would want to learn will have more facility.
So we know that it can help with your everyday life. It can help you with your work performance. It can help you deal with past experiences, change the way your default responses and behaviors to what you might have learned in the past and incorrectly associated, let's say, causality and correlation and causality, right? So it's let's say, a cognitive bias, I would say, something that we're all born with. Cultivating and working and improving your brain by learning new skills, again, has multiple advantages, not just in the jungle, but also in everyday life. It has been shown to delay the onset of dementia, regardless of its origin, the Alzheimer's, the Parkinson's, right? there are multiple benefits of doing so. So, Julie, how do you take care of your brain?
I am a lifelong learner, and I do well if I'm doing creative activities. So I play music. I have a band. I play jazz saxophone. But let's say if I'm sick and I can't do that, then I will make art. I'll paint or draw. So I find doing these creative activities is something that, is just very beneficial to me.
Mm-hmm.
And not only for my mental health or my mood, but it can help me to work as well.
Was this part of the reason for founding the Neurosalon?
Yes, it was. So I was suffering from brain injury. I had a concussion, and I found that I could work, but I didn't have any stamina. So I'd easily get a headache. And I was trying to figure out a way to increase my cognitive performance or the load that I could take on. I thought one way would be to integrate my interest in music and science. So I started this project called the Neurosalon, starting to merge arts and sciences together. But the more the project expanded and deepened, it really became about what we can understand about neuroplasticity and how we think we can make an impact by communicating this message to people, because everyone has a choice in their activities. So they can hopefully affect the composition of these neurochemicals in their brain by, selecting these positive neurochemicals and trying to stay away from things like anxiety provoking things like they might see on the news and, give cortisol release or something that's negative. So, and then we found that the individuals that were participating in the Neurosalon project were just very engaged in doing it because they hadn't had an experience where they could, let's say, pair their interest in sciences with the arts. As we've been going on, people have gravitated towards that message because it's just a fun thing to do. And that's an important thing to understand, is that we talked about dopamine in terms of like addiction and neuroplasticity, but it's just a feel-good molecule as well. Like, we feel gratification when we get dopamine. And so the more we can do that, the better it is for our brains. But we ourselves kind of have clues to what activities we can choose that would give us those neurochemicals and give us that reward. Just by understanding themselves, doing those activities that seem really enriching to them.
How can people find Neurosalon? Is there an easy way to find, learn more, participate, and
on neurosalon.net is our website.
Okay.
We have an Instagram account and a Facebook.
Okay.
Well.
Super. So if you allow us, we'll gladly link our and direct our listeners to learn more about Neurosalon as well. And you've just mentioned that you went through traumatic brain injury, right? But that's a rather unfortunate event. But many people that come to us for help, they start to noticing their own cognitive decline, typically with age, right? So maybe they're not thinking as fast as they used to. Maybe they see that the younger colleagues can more easily outperform them or sustain certain types of effort in the workplace for longer, or they appear sharper, right? They think faster. It's typically at the point where people start to notice the decline that has already happened. What can be done? What are the skills, for example, or activities that people can try or think about picking up or engaging in that will help them increase, restore, or the ability, or at least slow down the decline as we age?
You've probably heard of brain training games, and crossword puzzles, learning a new language or an instrument. These are all good things. And I think, from my perspective, although this is just my opinion, this is not validated scientifically, try to do those activities that you really, really enjoy, because that's your brain telling you, like, these activities are going to give you more dopamine if you continue to do them. And, so those internal signals are so important. And I think that we are just so wedded to looking at external cues for how we should live our lives and what would make us happy. And it's fine to do that a little bit, but it's really important to consider these internal cues so that you're doing those things that really will nurture you, really give you that intrinsic motivation, not you're just doing it because your friends are doing it or you saw it on the internet and it's a fad. Just really think about that. I think that's very important. Maintain cognitive function throughout life. And then the other thing is that as we age, we're not as sharp or not as quick. There are other cognitive skills that older people have from their experience. That's very important, and it may not be as detectable as being quick. But I
Yes.
think that's really important because there's this aspect of let's say, a cognitive self-judgment. So if you have like a judgment against yourself because you aren't as fast, let's say, as somebody else, then that might inhibit you from activating those parts of your brain that would be more creative.
Absolutely. Yes, and compensate, and that's something again as we teach as well. As people gain experience and pick up different skills as they go, provided that they continue to pick up new skills as they go through life, they can compensate, for example, for the speed of processing with other skills that they've obtained. And I think that the last aspect here is so we talked about what happens, let's say, after an injury, what happens when you notice that you're aging, you're trying to bring that to a certain level, but there are also healthy individuals who have well-functioning brains and they would like to perform even better. Research that has been conducted within the army structures, so trying to push the ability for accurate cognitive processing in young and healthy individuals, to enhance decision making under pressure, for example. So in those extreme environments, to push people beyond what would normally be expected, a lot of the neuroplasticity principles are being used and applied to increase the performance of healthy individuals. One of the outcomes of that research is things that are generally good for your brain and to maintain your brain in top shelf is learning multiple new activities, preferably activities that would involve multiple parts of the brain at the same time. So motoric function, auditory, visual, and combine them together. You've mentioned that you play music, right? Which is a great example of this highly demanding, probably one of the most cognitively demanding types of activities, right? It's a symbol recognition, it's auditory, it's synchronization, it's movement. Many parts of the brain need to be activated in order to read and play music and also play in sync with others, right, at the same time. Mentioned languages in the conversation earlier as well. So what would be the other examples of skills that are definitely good for our brains, that are good to learn regardless of how old we are or where we are in life?
I don't know for sure, but I think having sort of interesting, in-depth conversations could be one of those things. And people might talk about things and they might talk about people. So this is just my notion that maybe talking about ideas would be something that would stimulate so many different parts of the brain because it relies on your experience, but also relies on new information, and then changing your opinions based on what the feedback you get from other people. So I think that's sort of a way to exercise different parts of your brain that could be beneficial.
And so that would require you listening to or debating different things that you already believe in, right? So maybe listening to news sources that are of opposite political spectrum, or discussing things with people who hold different views or ideas to your own, right?
It's really important. We're doing less of that because before the cable news and internet, we all listened to the same news. So we could have different opinions, but we had the same starting information. But now we can just select the vehicle in which we're getting our news as shaded by these different political points of view. And so we're just in our isolated realms, not really interacting. And I think it's really important to have those debates, but it's very difficult to now because doing that through the internet just can end up with a lot of flame wars and things like that. So I think this idea of engaging with people with different mindsets, a skill in and of itself that I think it would be good if we created those spaces for people to do that, just so that they can have those experiences of not just the knee-jerk reaction, to really listen and think and to assess your own points of view to make sure that you're not.
Well, and you mentioned earlier doing things that is enjoyable. So perhaps that's where people can start doing activities or approaching activities like conversations or dialogues or even reading different books and then talking about them, but not for just the sake of learning something new, but actually learning to enjoy what you will learn as a result of that. But it also tends to be good for your brain long term anyway. And probably when you approach those kinds of other activities that will stimulate multiple parts of the brain, it probably helps to keep your stress levels down too. If you approach a conversation knowing it could be inflammatory or potentially debatable on either side, rather than coming into it already deciding that it's going to be a difficult conversation, maybe just approach it from a more objective point of view and then learn. Maybe the learning is simply in approaching it from in a different way. I'm thinking also about things we talk about doing very low level aerobic exercise. We talk about this all the time because it's good for your cardiorespiratory fitness, but it's also good for your brain. It's physical and it's also mental. I don't know that it necessarily stimulates all the multiple parts of your brain in the way that we're talking about playing music. But I think what it does do is it allows your body to be engaged physically, but it also allows for that internalization and that time to allow your brain to show you the things that you are not able to, we're filtering out constantly, or we're not able to focus on. So and Julie, you mentioned like your brain will tell you what you like to do, but it won't be telling you what you like to do if you're just scrolling through everything all the time or approaching conversations with stress. So I think maybe incorporating this low-level physical activity that we talk about will give us the external physical awareness of your physical space in your environment, but also the ability for all of your internalization to happen at the same time. And maybe to some extent music does the same thing, at least in my experience.
Right. I think exercise is really important, that low level exercise, but also things like meditation or prayer, just being in nature, non-goal directed activities, because some parts of our brain are more goal oriented and others are less so. So the frontal cortex that is involved in things like creative thought, they take a little bit longer to activate than, let's say, the back of our brain, our anger and fear centers. So, our fear centers are there to alert us very quickly if there's a threat. So we're really adapted for that to be a very fast process. But other things like trying to come up with a new idea or new thought based on what someone else would say takes a little bit longer. And the frontal cortex that mediates that just takes a little bit longer to kick in. But there's evidence that that part of the brain that is involved in problem solving and creativity is also mediating things like empathy. If you encourage, let's say you give someone an exercise that activates their empathy, then they'll later on score better on creativity tests and vice versa. So I think if you're practicing these conversations and building in that empathy for another person's perspective, you're also helping that part of your brain that would allow you to make novel solutions.
And of course, we're talking here about the benefits, well, beyond the obvious, right? Beyond the cardiovascular benefits of exercise, beyond the cortisol removal benefits of low-level activity, right? You've mentioned something about creativity tests. How do we measure creativity? How do I know I'm more creative than my neighbor?
Everyone is creative just in different ways. for the most part. And it's difficult to measure creativity. There are ways in which scientists do that. So there are convergent and divergent thinking tests. So divergent thinking would be coming up with novel solutions to familiar objects or something like this.
Mhm.
And convergent thinking is a little bit more logical and goal directed, trying to sift through a lot of information to come up with a solution. But both are considered important for creativity.
Mhm.
So those are ways in which scientists will measure creativity. But there's some design engineers that are coming up with their own ways to measure creativity. And in my studies, we do some studies in human creativity, and we include a creative behavioral inventory, which would be what activities do you do,
Okay.
and some of are considered
Mhm.
creative. But of course, we know that just because someone paints doesn't mean that they're creative. They could be the most
And
important thing is how you do it.
And I think the CBI, the cognitive behavioral inventory, if I remember correct, that's not a pleasant one to take, isn't it? I mean, because I think that it lists numerous categories of people's possible creative achievements. For example, your ability to draw or paint, or musical, right, or performance, or word or literature related, or your ability to let's say be scientifically or technically creative, regardless of which type of area we measure. But then the gradation is simply having an interest in something, and then it escalates very rapidly. For example, do you listen to music as a let's say level 0? And then it's like, one, well, have you ever tried playing music? Have you ever composed something? Have you been paid for composing and recognized internationally for it? And it's, if I remember correctly, that's something that really quickly puts you down in a
Totally.
place believing you might not be as creative as you think you are.
Yeah,
Is that the
it's
test that we're
interesting.
talking about here?
Well, I think the version that we give is not it's not so demanding as that
Uh-huh.
in terms of like rating yourself. I think there's certain parts of your brain that are for judgment.
Mm-hmm.
You need to assess whether, let's say, something that you think could be food has any nutritional value or is
Mm-hmm.
toxic. So you need to have a judgmental part of your brain that can assess
Correct.
these distinctions. And in our society, we honed that skill quite a lot. If you have a PhD, you definitely honed it way too much. And if you apply those skills to your own self or even to other people,
Mm-hmm.
and say, I'm going to judge that person based on are they as smart as me or do they have a PhD and they don't?
Mm-hmm.
What's wrong with you? That's very, very damaging. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to really almost teach people that it's important to develop these uh, assessment skills,
Mm-hmm.
but then not to apply them in so many different instances. Just apply them when you need to, because we apply it to ourselves in the most damaging ways. I think we damage ourselves more than anything. But of course, it's really bad to assess other people in that way as well.
Yes, and other people or self, because like we work with people with, let's say, significantly developed the J components, and again, typically very highly intelligent people who have a superpower, but if it's not controlled well, they apply it in a wrong way, very often to themselves, and sometimes in a very self-destructive, self-diminishing, self-limiting way. There are different areas in which people can be creative, and it does not necessarily you don't necessarily need to be able to paint or write music, right? Maybe your creativity is in exploring ideas or inventing new products or
Well,
writing poems, right? You can or
well,
building things,
it could be you enjoy gardening or
gardening.
building car engines.
Mhm.
It doesn't have to be something we think of as creative. It's
That's it.
something that we enjoy.
Hmm.
If we enjoy it, we'll probably come up with new ideas because we're
Hmm.
enjoying it and we're thinking about it. We're getting all those neurochemicals. Um, and so it doesn't have to be something that's traditionally associated with the arts. But I think the really important thing is just to kind of try to turn off that part of your brain when you're doing these activities, so you're not judging yourself. Because when you're trying something
Right.
new, of course, you're not going to be as skilled as it. So people tend to feel more comfortable doing things that they're skilled at.
Mhm.
But it's really important now to say, be uncomfortable, that's
Mhm.
fine. And just turn off that part of your brain. Like when I perform, I've been performing, I usually play with jazz musicians, professional jazz musicians. So since I'm a scientist, I'm not at that level. And the only way I've been managed to do that is just turn off that part of my brain that's
Mhm.
judging
Mhm.
myself. Because over time, by playing with these great musicians, then it's increased my skill.
Of
I might
course.
not be to their level, but I'm closer and closer all the time.
Mhm.
But if I had that judgmental part of my brain
Mhm.
going, then I never would have done that because I would have just been
Mhm.
too, there'd
And
be too much difference.
and some say that maybe one reason why children learn easily is because they're not afraid to make mistake. They're not afraid to not be good at something straight away, right? They are curious and happy to explore, and they understand that they just need to keep trying, keep learning, keep improving, and eventually they build those skills much faster if they would be telling themselves a story why they're not good before they even start learning something, right? So
Right.
that's a very interesting concept.
Can I just ask, when you decide
Mhm.
to turn off that part of the brain, because sometimes people describe it as I'm too anxious at night, or it might keep people awake, it might impact people's sleep, or not just their
Mhm.
ability to just go for it. And what is in the space between deciding that you are shutting that part of the brain off and then doing the thing like playing? And by the way, you're an excellent performer. I know this for a fact. You're very humble. But in that space between, what does it feel like to actually turn off or turn down or quiet that kind of noise?
I think when it's something like a performance that you're looking forward to, you can sort of weigh the benefits that you gain from doing it, and knowing that if you were judging yourself doing it, it would really mar the whole experience. So
Mm-hmm.
you have that ability to weigh those competing ideas. And then in terms of sleeping, that's a little bit difficult because you can't control whether you can to, whether you can go to sleep or not. And I guess the only thing I would say to that is that I think what we've been talking about and what you guys are trying to do, and also in a different way through the Neurosalon, is about building resilience in people's lives. So having people have a wide diversity of skill sets that they can apply to the challenges in their lives. So it's not so much saying like, okay, you don't deserve to have anything negative happen to you. It's saying negative things are going to happen to you, but we can help you with these different domains and that'll be in your toolkit that you can
Mhm.
rely upon. And one of the things that we've been talking about is light a candle and take a bath to relax yourself and reduce your stress.
Mhm.
It's doing activities that really invigorate you, really engage you, that you're just so happy to be doing. And that creates a buffer zone, I
Mhm.
think, that helps to these challenges in your life a little bit more like, not like mountains, but little like speed bumps.
So we talked about things that are good for our brain. I would like to move to things that are bad for our brain as well. We've already talked about nicotine, but before we do this, there is a subject, Julie. Since I already have you here with us on a podcast, is again going back to this concept of neuroplasticity. What about certain substances, pharmacological substances? I'm referring here specifically to psychedelics that have been studied in context of of improving people's neuroplasticity, defined as essentially helping their brains to change that up and learn. And I'm speaking here specifically referring to the example that you have given, that it might be sometimes difficult for adults to overcome certain processes or things that automatic responses or reactions that they have learned when they were children. There has been research into substances that are currently classed illegal as class A drugs but there's quite a lot of evidence to show that they might play an important role in helping our brains restore or improve its neuroplasticity. Do you have any views or knowledge on that topic?
I think it's really interesting, and I'd like to know more about it. I know people who have used it that have really helped them with pretty severe mood disorders and different things, and read a little bit of the literature on it. So I think it should be researched more. There's a lot of promise there, but it's also problematic because it has a negative stigma. So it might be a little bit harder to get like funding for that sort of thing. But I mean, I guess from my perspective, I see it as we can achieve those conditions within our brain through our own activities and not need these external compounds. It wouldn't be for everyone. So for some people, it might be beneficial. I think I can't say I would endorse it or denigrate it.
Yes, and because I believe there is a biological mechanism in which we could explain why they could potentially work, and again, but the research right now, as you said, is difficult. Funding is difficult. Those substances are considered to be illegal at the moment in most countries. But what would be? Is there a theoretical, at least, mechanism in why they would help?
I think several of the molecules that are associated with neuroplasticity have been seen to be affected by psychedelics. The one that's probably might have heard of would be BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is important for synaptic plasticity. So it aids in that the changes, the longer-term change that would happen at the synaptic level, but then at the circuit level as well.
So I think it's the same mechanism you said that you could probably achieve without pharmacological shortcuts. It would simply take longer or require a little bit more effort.
I would say that's what I'm hoping for. Yeah. That's what I hope to be able to do or to be able to communicate. We haven't actually done that much research on the effects of, let's say, neurosalon activities. We started to collect information about people, their thoughts about if they're creative or conduct more creative activities after they participate in a neurosalon event, and that looks very promising. So we'd like to do some real.
So psychedelics may be promising. We don't know where this could lead us. We don't know if we could develop maybe compounds that do not have hallucinogenic effects, but could still help to restore the brain function or help us deal with certain things. What about things that we know? So we already talked about that smoking or nicotine, right? Not a good thing for your brain, even if it doesn't come from a cigarette, but just as a substance on its own, and it's the mechanism and its impact on multiple receptors in the brain, not a great thing for neuroplasticity. What else what are the substances, behaviors, or things we should be avoiding to keep our brains healthy?
Too much stress, I would say. Also things that short circuit our dopamine system, like the internet. It can be so addicting because we can just, activate our dopamine system without any effort. We need to be aware of that and to try to engage in other activities that, they might take a little bit more effort to start out with, but in the long run are going to be much more.
Okay, so no shortcut. So anything that gives us a burst of dopamine without putting the effort in, we should try to consciously at least avoid or be aware of its impact. Anything else? Any other things that people should be avoiding?
I mentioned cortisol.
Yes, as
stress hormone. Any sort of drug and stressful relationships. I think, from my perspective, it boils down to, as individuals, we're all going to seek pleasure and avoid negative things. And there's nothing really wrong with seeking that pleasure. We should do that, but we just have to be careful of what those things are. And there are some pretty severe experiences like bullying and things like that can rewire your brain in such a way that negative events give you a dopamine release. And that's really difficult because you can get trapped into cycles of abusive situations or abusive relationships because you're actually getting dopamine from them. It takes a little while then to reprogram so that you don't
And
have
how would
that.
we? So let's say in case when that happens, would leads to that cycle. I mean, for example, we could see this in some cases of domestic abuse or domestic violence, right? How would we? How would an individual work or try to work and approach this to try to kind of to reverse this mechanism?
This is really, I think that's the domain of experts and psychologists
Mm-hmm.
and experts in that area.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say from a neuroscience perspective, that is this idea of choice. If there are other options that people can choose to get dopamine, then they can choose that. If they're not, if you don't have a choice, it's easier to fall into drug abuse or other abusive.
Another thing is when we sometimes go on the internet, there are loads of people who will say or try to convince you that there are things that you can eat, supplements that you can take, or foods you should or shouldn't be eating that are good or bad for your brain. Is there any evidence for any of those claims that you're aware of?
It's hard. It's hard to sift through because the science is coming out and changing our information.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those people that are selling things are taking a hint of that data and then making it into a product. The strongest correlation has to do with taking different lipids like omega-3s, positive cognitive outcomes, especially like dementias.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a strong correlation. The other thing, like so, for instance, like choline is recommended because it's a precursor to acetylcholine. That might be something I would do, but I actually haven't looked at the data for that.
Mm-hmm.
But it just sort of, as a scientist, I think, okay, increase the precursors, you could potentially increase the neurotransmitter.
Yes, and of course, and when it comes to omega-3, it doesn't have to be from supplements, of course, right? It can be nuts, seeds, oily fish, right? They can be. We don't need to supplement those things. It can simply come from healthy diets.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's best to do that from a healthy diet, but if you can't, then the supplements can
Mm-hmm.
be helpful, especially good quality ones. So you have to be careful because it's not as regulated. So you have to make sure you're getting it from good suppliers. Oh, and I don't know if you guys have looked into the microbiome, but there's really fascinating data coming out about our gut bacteria
Mm-hmm.
and some strains that help release neurotransmitters like serotonin, and it can really have an effect on mood.
Mm-hmm.
It's really fascinating because our diet can affect our microbiome.
Mm-hmm.
So what we eat could really have this pretty direct.
That is correct, and it's also we need to take into account that there are more bacteria living inside of our gut than we have all the other cells in our bodies combined, right, including the brain cells. So it's there's a fascinating research in that space that yes, we are aware of this. We are at least aware of the emerging data as well. Professor Tim Spector and his team are doing a lot in that space as well, although a little bit on a commercial side of things. But there's a lot of good data coming out from the databases and studies that they have set up. So yes, it is an emerging field, and we're keeping a close eye on that as well.
I think in terms of supplements, it's a judgment call for the individual because I know for certain disorders, like for concussion, there's no drug treatment for people with concussion. So I will look at supplements and I'll take some of them, and I won't necessarily know for a fact if they're going to help me or not. I just have to make an educated guess because I could say I'm going to wait until all the data is out, but I'm waiting a long time. In the meanwhile, I have this impaired cognitive load capacity. So I do some individualistic correlation. So I'll look at the effect if I take something. Does that?
Yes, and I think this is an interesting area as well because we know that those substances or supplements more or less legal. A lot of that research has been going on in the former Soviet bloc. I mean, they were far more advanced in researching the impact of pharmaceuticals in brain and brain function than we are in a Western world, and that data doesn't often come up to light, or it's not really readily accepted in mainstream medicine.
Other data that's pretty clear for the brain, and as far as not what to avoid, is the alcohol, and we also know that there's direct impacts on the gut microbiome too. So alcohol and neuroplasticity don't go very well together. We know that there's a lot of data on that. What else is being studied in the neuroplasticity? Is there anything else that we are forgetting?
Well, I think exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Exercise, and there are other things like music or certain brain waves.
Mm-hmm.
You would think that it's scientifically valid, but the data is very, very strong that certain brain waves are correlated with improved cognitive function and even reversal of disorders like Alzheimer's disease pathology in animal models.
Mm-hmm.
And they're looking at that now in clinical trials on humans as well.
Yes, and it's not just for recovery. I think it has been studied as a way to improve cognitive functions, rapid memory and learning. Right. I think there's a fascinating research going on that supports this kind of a long-term potentiation, and that is crucial for learning.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an emerging evidence that it could prove to be beneficial.
How much rest is required to reinforce neuroplasticity?
I think not having a sleep deficit is important for neuroplasticity and for reduction of stress hormones as well.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has a different requirement.
So between taking care of your brain and recovering from your concussion, which is long term, and playing music, teaching, and recovery, how much time do you spend on your brain every day?
You mean trying to improve my brain?
Taking care of it and improving, yes.
I'd say the majority of the time. But there's certain things that I might do, like spend too much time on the internet. And then I've been sick for the past year, so I haven't been doing anything on the computer, no computer games. But since I started to get a little bit better, I, said, I'm playing these computer games, which I shouldn't do. But then since that time, my rate of acceleration has really improved. People have been noticing. And I go, I don't know if that's because of the computer games, which I think of as a negative thing. I'm wasting time, but maybe I'm helping my brain because I'm doing that.
Yes, I think that's another fascinating area when it comes to video gaming, because yes, you're right. You're balancing between wasting time and potentially addiction as well, right? This quick dopamine release, but also the relatively well-established and proven positive impacts of video games on cognition, memory, consolidation, learning, spatial awareness, and multiple other areas. So I think a lot depends on the game choice and the time we spend playing them.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
What about a class of medicines, prescription medicines called nootropics? I think that gets a lot of attention in certain circles, or let's say outside of the mainstream medicine, maybe for the right reason. Do you have any view on what are those, how they work, and if they work?
No, they're interesting. I would like to try them, but I don't know if the data are.
Caffeine is very well researched, right? So both in terms of kind of a mostly alertness when it comes to cognitive function, right? Concentration, reaction time. Yes, but there are quite a few others that are frequently prescribed or taken by students trying to learn. I was wondering if there's any new evidence coming out, because again, it's been a while since I prescribed any of them, but they seem to be popular in certain circles.
I don't know. That's so individualistic. I guess people try it, and if they see that it's helping them, they'll continue it. It's also can be quite expensive. So
okay, but I understand that so far, again, you haven't seen a convincing evidence that this is something that people should do to universally improve their brain function or anything like that. It's not a common practice, I understand.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, I'm a bit neutral on that. I think one thing about the gaming that we were talking about is just an idea that I tried to communicate is that the more we can diversify the ways in which we get dopamine, the different types of activities that are able to forestall or prevent addiction, and if we really try to keep that diversity in balance, then maybe we'll notice like, I've been spending way too much time on these games and I didn't get my X thing done in time, and that's a negative. So you can assess how you're spending your time And because you have other choices, before you get too addicted to one thing, you then have a chance to just move over to another thing and like prevent yourself from getting too addicted.
Yes. So we know that in our practice, when we work with people, we do abuse in a way those certain mechanisms or tendencies that our brains have in order to keep us on track. Right? Dopamine can be used, or the dopamine mechanisms to keep you on track to your goals. Right? To help you build habits, to help you to stay on a path of success. By for example, with breaking things into smaller tasks. In the same way that the cognitive dissonance can be used to make you do certain things, right? Or try to, you can abuse certain mechanisms into the way the brain works in order to build a successful self. We had today, I think this is a very promising area for the future as well. And as we're learning more about how the brain works, how the connection between our bodies and the brains, and how all the systems work together, how our gut microbiome contributes to the brain function. I think there's still a lot to explore.
And neuroplasticity doesn't mean just doing creative things or deciding whether you're creative and then doing something. It's doing something good for the brain or even avoiding things that are bad for the brain. So, Julie, you gave us a lot of things and practical advice and tips. And is there any one remaining idea or thought you would like to share to close the conversation?
One thing that we haven't touched on that we hope to tell people and give them the message is that all these things, all these different activities that can be helpful to them for their neuroplasticity, it's worth it to take the time out to do that. So if you're a very busy person, a busy parent, or you have a lot of different responsibilities, you might think that it would be selfish to take the time out for yourself, but it actually is very important. And we hope that when people understand how beneficial it would be, not only for them, but for the people that they're caring for or that they can give to, then it gives them that feeling, that license.
Julie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was such a cool conversation, and we will link the Neurosalon and more about links too. Thank you again. It was really such a pleasure to have you today.
Thanks for inviting me. I had so much fun. I learned a lot too.
It's an amazing topic. I'm very happy, Julie, we met today. I'm fascinated by brain, by neuroplasticity, by ways to keep people's cognitive performance and my own up as well. It's one of the things that losing my brain is one of the things I fear the most. So it's fascinating to speak to people who know something about this, who research this, and who do and set up things for people to enable their them to take care of their brains. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. So thank you very much.